Sanctions pressure intensified, and oil markets responded immediately. Oil prices jumped by about 5% after the United States announced sanctions against Russia's largest companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. This U.S. measure, taken against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine that has been going on for almost 4 years, marked a significant escalation of economic pressure on Moscow and has already had a tangible impact on the global energy market. The Trump administration took this step, demonstrating a sharp change in its approach to Russia. Previously, Washington had tried to avoid direct sanctions against strategic companies such as Rosneft and Lukoil, which were considered a last resort due to the risk of a global oil crisis. Until recently, Washington was hesitant to impose tough restrictions on Russia's energy sector for fear of destabilizing the market, and Trump himself reportedly resisted such measures for several months. However, the lack of progress in resolving the conflict and the protracted war in Ukraine forced the White House to reconsider its position. On the eve of the sanctions, Trump's planned meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin fell through. The American leader canceled the summit, saying that he did not feel that now was the right time for negotiations. The next day, Washington demonstrated a new toughness. The U.S. Treasury Department announced the inclusion of Rosneft and Lukoil in the sanctions lists as companies whose revenues, according to U.S. estimates, directly fuel the continuation of the war. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, announcing the sanctions, stressed that they had become necessary because of Putin's refusal to end this senseless war. According to him, it is the oil exports of Russia's largest companies that fuel the Kremlin's war machine. Speaking in the Oval Office of the White House alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump expressed hope that the new sanctions would not have to remain in place for too long, hinting that their purpose was to push Moscow toward peace rather than permanently cut Russian oil off from the market. The president noted his disappointment with the stagnation of the ceasefire negotiations. "Every time I talk to Vladimir, the conversation is good, but it doesn't lead to anything," Trump said, making it clear that Washington's patience is running out. The current sanctions package targets two pillars of Russia's oil industry that are crucial to its economy and budget. The state-owned company Rosneft, the country's largest oil producer controlled by the Kremlin, accounts for a significant portion, according to some estimates, about half of all oil production in Russia. Lukoil is Russia's second-largest oil company and the country's largest private oil corporation. Together, these two companies account for about 70% of Russia's crude oil exports by sea, equivalent to approximately 3.1 million barrels per day. For comparison, in 2024, Russia remained the world's second-largest oil producer after the U.S., and any disruption to its exports could significantly affect global oil supply. The sanctions imposed by the U.S. mean that Rosneft and Lukoil's assets in the U.S. jurisdiction will be frozen, and American individuals and legal entities will be prohibited from any business contacts with these companies and their structures. Moreover, dozens of subsidiaries and affiliates of these oil giants have been targeted by the restrictions, as Washington attempts to block the back channels that Russian companies could use to access Western markets and finance. The key point is the risk of so-called secondary sanctions. Foreign firms, including banks and trading intermediaries, have been explicitly told that dealing with Rosneft or Lukoil could result in their exclusion from the U.S. financial system. In effect, this is an ultimatum. Buyers and financiers around the world must choose whether to continue working with Russian oil, risking losing access to dollar settlements and Western banks. The markets reacted instantly to the news of the sanctions. Oil prices shot up during Thursday morning trading. By midday, the international benchmark Brent had risen in price by almost 5.4%, exceeding $65 per barrel, the highest since early October. U.S. crude oil rose by about 5.7%, approaching $62 per barrel. This is one of the sharpest one-time jumps in prices in recent months. Prices for petroleum products jumped even more noticeably. For example, diesel fuel futures in the U.S. added about 7%. The sharp rise in prices reflects traders' concerns that sanctions against the world's second-largest oil producer could lead to a reduction in market supply. Analysts note that the news of the blocking of such major exporters as Rosneft and Lukoil caused a kind of shock increase in prices on the market. This is a serious escalation that could change the balance of power in the global oil market and possibly create a supply shortage as early as next year, said David Oxley, chief economist for commodities and climate at Capital Economics. In other words, if Russian supplies are significantly reduced and are not replaced by other sources, the world may face a relative oil shortage and price increases in the long term. Some experts, however, believe that the initial market reaction may be excessive. As the impact of the sanctions is understood, prices may fall back slightly. They point to the continuing weakening of demand due to general uncertainty in the global economy, a factor that will continue to hold back the oil rally. Nevertheless, the very fact that prices jumped 5% in a single day underscores the seriousness of the changes taking place in the market. The new U.S. sanctions immediately affected the behavior of key buyers of Russian oil in Asia. China, the world's largest importer of energy resources and one of the main consumers of Russian raw materials, has signaled its willingness to comply with the restrictions, fearing secondary sanctions. According to industry sources, Chinese state-owned oil companies have temporarily suspended new purchases of Russian offshore oil produced by Rosneft and Lukoil. Chinese importers have clearly taken a pause to assess the risks. It is critical for them to maintain access to international payments and insurance, and any deals with companies subject to sanctions threaten to disrupt this stability. While Beijing has not made any sharp statements, the very fact that purchases have been suspended indicates that the Chinese market does not intend to directly challenge U.S. restrictions. At least the major state players are trying to act cautiously. Washington, in turn, is trying to exert influence through diplomatic channels. Trump has said he intends to discuss the continuation of Chinese purchases of Russian oil directly with Chinese President Xi Jinping at their upcoming meeting, urging Beijing to use its influence on Moscow to end the conflict. India, another giant in Asian oil demand, also faces a difficult choice. After the start of the war in Ukraine, India became the largest buyer of Russian oil, taking advantage of discounts and weaker competition from Europe. But now Indian refiners may need to sharply reduce purchases of raw materials from Russia to avoid falling under sanctions. According to industry sources, several large Indian oil refining companies are already considering plans to significantly cut or even completely stop imports of Russian oil in the coming weeks. India's largest private oil company, Reliance Industries, which has recently been one of the main buyers of Russian raw materials, plans to almost completely abandon such supplies, according to insiders. It is worth recalling that over the past 2 years, China and India have effectively replaced Europe as the main buyers of Russian oil. In 2024, China imported a record 109 million tons of crude oil from Russia, almost 20% of its total energy imports, while India imported about 88 million tons. By comparison, in 2021, Indian imports of Russian oil were negligible, less than 1 million tons, and Chinese purchases were significantly lower than current levels. This rapid growth has made Beijing and New Delhi critically important customers for Moscow, which explains why their response to U.S. sanctions is so important. If Indian importers do take such a step, it will remove a significant volume of Russian exports from the market, increasing pressure on Moscow but also potentially reducing global oil supply if no replacement is found. It should be noted that Washington has long tried to persuade New Delhi to reduce its dependence on cheap Russian oil. Even before the current sanctions were imposed, the Trump administration signaled its dissatisfaction with India's position. In August, the U.S. even raised customs duties on a number of Indian goods by 25%, demonstrating its displeasure with India's continued active purchase of energy resources from Russia at reduced prices. Now, with a direct sanctions ban, the pressure on the Indian authorities and businesses has increased many times over. India is faced with a dilemma: either reduce profitable imports and look for other sources of oil, or risk falling under Western financial restrictions. The Indian leadership will probably try to maneuver, but there are already signs of its willingness to comply with the sanctions regime. Washington's European allies have supported the new wave of sanctions. Just a week ago, the UK announced its own restrictions against Rosneft and Lukoil, and shortly after the US move, a pan-European decision followed. EU member states agreed on the 19th package of sanctions against Russia since the start of the war. Among other things, this package includes a ban on imports of Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, as well as sanctions against a number of foreign companies helping Moscow to circumvent the restrictions. It should be noted that the bulk of Russian oil exports to Europe had already been halted by previous sanctions packages. Since December 2022, the EU has imposed an embargo on maritime deliveries of Russian oil and a price cap on it. Thus, the new measures are aimed more at eliminating the remaining loopholes and additional sources of income for Moscow in the energy sector. Against the backdrop of the risk of a reduction in Russian exports, The position of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, is attracting particular attention. Many experts are wondering whether OPEC and its allies will be able to compensate for a possible supply shortage if Russian oil begins to disappear from the market in significant volumes. In the first hours after the sanctions were announced, reassuring signals came from the capital of one of the leading members of the cartel, Kuwait. Kuwait's oil minister said that OPEC is closely monitoring the situation and is ready to adjust its production policy if necessary to prevent a sharp shortage of oil on the world market. This means that OPEC countries may review previous production restrictions and increase production to compensate for the loss of Russian barrels. However, such decisions are not made instantly. They require agreement among all participants in the OPEC Plus agreement, including Russia itself, which is part of the expanded format. It is also unclear to what extent other major producers, such as Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, are prepared to quickly increase exports, given that until recently they were cutting production in an effort to support prices. It should not be forgotten that sanctions against the Russian oil sector are not being imposed in a vacuum. They are influenced by both military and diplomatic events. Simultaneously with the news of sanctions from Washington, the Kremlin conducted demonstrations of its strategic nuclear forces, and on the day the sanctions were announced, the Russian army fired missiles at Kiev. These events only increase the tension and sense of unpredictability that are also factored into oil market forecasts. In this environment, any OPEC initiative to stabilize prices will have not only economic, but also political implications, demonstrating whose side the Middle East partners are on, Moscow's or Washington's. The Russian leadership has traditionally responded to the new sanctions with uncompromising rhetoric. Vladimir Putin said that it would not be easy for the world to quickly replace Russian oil and called the American restrictions another attempt by the West to put pressure on Russia. According to the Russian president, Moscow does not intend to act under anyone's dictates, making it clear that it will not make concessions due to economic pressure. In fact, since the start of the war, the Russian oil industry has already adapted to life under sanctions. Exports have been redirected from Europe to Asia, a shadow logistics supply chain has been built up using a fleet of tankers without official flags, and transactions have been switched to alternative currencies and payment mechanisms. Previously, numerous sanctions and embargoes, including the price cap on Russian oil imposed by the West, failed to completely knock Moscow out of the oil market, although they did force it to sell its raw materials at a significant discount. Therefore, the Kremlin is convinced that Washington's current move will not be a one-sided game. Russian oil will continue to find buyers, even if it means working through more complex schemes and at higher costs. Nevertheless, behind the ostensible confidence lies real concern. Oil exports remain a key source of revenue for the Russian budget, especially during a costly military campaign. If the new sanctions lead to even Chinese and Indian partners reducing their purchases, and financial intermediaries become afraid to deal with Russian companies, Moscow could face a significant decline in oil and gas revenues. This is already happening. Under pressure from sanctions and falling global prices, Rosneft's profits for the first half of 2025 fell by 2/3 compared to the previous year, while Lukoil's profits for 2024 fell by almost 27%. New barriers could exacerbate these trends. Russian companies may have to sell oil at even greater discounts to non-public traders, seek longer and more expensive delivery routes, and engage smaller banks for settlements, all of which reduce the industry's efficiency and bring less money to the budget. Economists note that although previous rounds of sanctions did not cause exports to collapse, their cumulative effect is gradually increasing. Pavel Molchanov, a strategic analyst at investment firm Raymond James, believes that this time around, it is unlikely that the situation will change dramatically in one fell swoop. Russia will still find ways to sell its oil, but now it will have to do so more covertly and at greater expense. This means that in the long term, the pressure of sanctions will still undermine the Kremlin's resource base, albeit not immediately. The step taken by the US marks a new phase in both the geopolitical confrontation and the dynamics of the oil market. On the one hand, Washington has made it clear that it is prepared to tighten economic pressure on Moscow, to the point of taking measures that were previously considered too risky due to the potential damage to the global economy. US officials have already stated that this is not the end. If the fighting does not stop, further steps will follow. Sanctions against Russian oil giants have served as a kind of wake-up call for countries that have continued to cooperate with Russia in the energy sector. They have been shown that no one is immune from being caught up in the whirlwind of sanctions if they contribute to financing the Russian military machine. On the other hand, such a major intervention in the global energy supply structure inevitably carries risk for the initiators themselves. The rapid rise in oil prices immediately after the sanctions were announced is causing concern about inflation and economic stability, primarily in the US and Europe. The White House is probably counting on coordination with allies, such as Saudi Arabia, and OPEC's willingness to increase production to help mitigate market turmoil. However, there is no guarantee that compensation will come in a timely manner and in sufficient volume. In the event of a prolonged fuel shortage, discontent with rising prices may intensify among American voters, creating domestic political pressure on the administration in Washington. Thus, the world is entering a period of heightened uncertainty in the oil market. Energy sanctions are becoming one of the central instruments of pressure in the war, and their effect will be closely monitored by all parties. The coming months will show whether the US and its partners will succeed in significantly undermining Russia's oil revenues without serious damage to themselves. One thing is clear for now. The market's reaction has proven that the actions against Rosneft and Lukoil are perceived as a truly significant event. Oil prices, geopolitics, and the economic interests of the major powers have become tightly intertwined, and this knot will have to be untangled in a situation where neither side is willing to back down. The new sanctions have set the tone for this new reality. No one will be able to remain neutral, and all participants will have to adapt to the rapidly changing rules of the game. The world is watching to see whether Washington's risky move will lead to the desired results, a speedy peace in Ukraine, or whether it will result in a protracted restructuring of the global oil market.